This is Glenn Fulcher with another issue of Language Testing Bites. Welcome to issue 33 of Language Testing Bites. In volume 38.2 of the journal, we publish another paper on the increasingly hot topic of language assessment literacy, with the intriguing title, Am I Qualified to be a Language Tester? Now, in this article, Jason Fan from the University of Melbourne and Xun Yan from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign ask what the assessment literacy needs of three stakeholder groups are. Now, I'm particularly interested in this paper because the authors serendipitously arrive at a position that I have recently argued for, and yet we haven't read each other's work until now, that is. Now, while I normally try to avoid reference to myself in these podcasts, in this one I intend to break with tradition. Thanks for agreeing to talk to our listeners on issue 33 of Language Testing Bites.
Hi, Glenn. Thanks for having us and for giving us this wonderful opportunity to share our research.
Language assessment literacy has taken off as an area of research in the past few years. I originally interviewed Ofra Inbar about language assessment literacy, and then last year talked to Bart Dagers, who had conducted research into language assessment literacy for university entrance decisions. Therefore, I'm going to assume that our listeners will know what language assessment literacy, or LAL, is from those podcasts, or can go and listen to them. But your research is different. Building on Linda Taylor's suggestion that different stakeholders would have different assessment literacy needs, you've investigated three stakeholder groups. Can you tell us who the groups are, why you chose them, and what evidence we currently have that LAL acquisition varies by group?
Sure. In this study, we focused on three stakeholder groups and explored how contextual and experiential factors influenced their LAL profile and development. The three stakeholder groups are language testers, EFL teachers, and graduate students. We selected the first group, that is language testers, because we believe understanding the LAL profile and development of this stakeholder group is crucial to theorize LAL development of other stakeholder groups. In the current LAL literature, language testers are often depicted as a homogeneous group with well-rounded competence in all components of LAL. Furthermore, this stakeholder group is typically used as the benchmark to evaluate the LAL profile of other stakeholder groups. This assumption, however, has rarely been questioned. Our study therefore aims to make a foray into this assumption. The second stakeholder group, that is EFL teachers, has been the focus of a lot of studies on LAL. However, limited research has been undertaken to explore the differences of LAL profile and development of EFL teachers with different experiences in assessment, and also working in different assessment and educational contexts. Finally, we also included graduate students who are an important stakeholder group in LAL research. By including the three distinct stakeholder groups, our study aims to compare the LAL profile and development across the three groups, as well as reveal individual differences within each group. Our study was mainly instigated by Linda Taylor's assumption that different stakeholder groups possess differential LAL competencies, though this characterization has not been subject to much empirical research.
Well, thanks. That covers the background in the literature. So let's move on to your empirical research. Can you explain your research questions and the context of the research?
We investigated two research questions in this study. The first research question is, do stakeholder groups exhibit differences in LAL profile and development? And the second research question is, do individuals in each stakeholder group exhibit differences in LAL profile and development? As mentioned previously, we targeted 3 stakeholder groups in this study, working in the Chinese educational context. For EFL teachers, we focused on those working in both secondary and tertiary education because of their quite different work contexts. As some of you might know, in China's secondary education, high-stakes tests such as 中考, that is the entrance examination into senior high schools, and 高考, that is the entrance examination into universities, play a very significant role in the lives of students and teachers. English is a compulsory subject for both 中考 and 高考 for most students. Because of the high-stakes nature of 中考 and 高考, it is not surprising that English language teaching and learning is largely driven by the preparation for and the ultimate success on these tests. Compared with secondary education, high-stakes English tests do not play such a significant role in China's tertiary education. For teachers working in tertiary education, we further divided them into 2 subgroups, that is, those teaching non-English major university students and those teaching English major students, because they tend to come from quite different backgrounds with different job responsibilities and performance expectations. The former group delivers English language courses with a heavier teaching load, whereas the latter group usually teaches content courses and focuses more on research. Therefore, it is likely that they exhibit different LAL profile and development due to different experiences and work contexts.
Great. And can you very briefly outline the methodology you used to address your research questions?
This is a quantitative study. We employed the grounded theory approach, which is suited to an exploratory study aiming to generate a theoretical framework. We recruited 20 participants, including 4 language testers, 8 EFL teachers, and 8 PhD students. Because the participants work in different contexts, we further divided EFL teachers into 3 subgroups, with 4 working in secondary education, 2 teaching non-English major students in tertiary education, and another 2 teaching English major students in tertiary education. We also divided graduate students into 2 groups, with 4 focusing on language testing in their degree study and 4 on other areas of language studies. We conducted an in-depth semi-structured interview with each participant. The interviews were conducted in Chinese, the participant's first language. The data was then transcribed and coded in vivo. We used open coding method to code the data iteratively in vivo to identify the factors that shaped the participants' LAL profile and development. After several rounds of coding, we were able to identify 3 major categories from the data: personal background and teaching and assessment practice, assessment training experience, and LAL and its development. My co-author Xun and I coded 15% of the data together, and we discussed our coding results. We calculated Cohen's kappa statistic to evaluate intercoder reliability.
That's a great summary. Many of our listeners are research students, and one of the contributions that we can make is to provide examples of how we explain why our methods are selected. But let's move on to the findings. Can you summarize your key findings that contribute to the literature and research on LAL?
Sure. I can summarize our main findings in two aspects. That is, we observed differences in language assessment literacy profiles among our participants at both group and individual levels. At the group level, language testing researchers and students demonstrated greater familiarity with assessment concepts than EFL teachers. During our interviews, the testing researchers and the testing students were more experienced in assessment research, and they were more capable of self-assessing their assessment literacy and verbalizing their assessment literacy development process. In contrast, the EFL teachers were less familiar with assessment terminologies and concepts, but they tended to have a range of experience with assessment development in their own teaching contexts, and they tend to have a pretty good level of assessment intuition. These profile differences tend to align with Taylor's Spiderweb model. However, what was surprising to us is that when teachers were broken down by instructional contexts, we noticed that the tertiary level teachers for English majors exhibited the least familiarity with assessment concepts. And they also showed a general lack of interest in assessment or assessment literacy development. The explanation we have for this is that English majors at Chinese universities tend to be taught by tenure-track faculty members in literature and cultural studies. These professors tend not to be trained in applied linguistics. In addition, the evaluation and promotion system in Chinese universities tend not to incentivize any kind of service work related to assessment development or assessment training. So that's probably why these group of stakeholders showed the sort of least interest to LAL development. At the individual level, each participant experienced a slightly different LAL development process. Interestingly, even the language testing researchers showed different strengths and weaknesses in their assessment-related knowledge and skills. But through a closer look at each participant's self-reflections, we noticed that all participants' LAL profiles are shaped by their assessment experience and assessment context. The influential contextual factors can include things like instructional context, educational policy, and resources and support for professional development in the local context. Experiential factors can include prior assessment coursework, experience in test development, experience in testing research, and experience in test development.
From what you've learned, you suggest that an apprenticeship model may be the basis for an appropriate LAL pedagogy for these stakeholder groups. Now, as you now know, I've recently written about this in relation to my own approach to teaching language testing, which was published in Dina Tsagari's 2020 volume, entitled Language Assessment Literacy from Theory to Practice. And I developed my own apprenticeship model through writing practical language testing, and particularly the test design cycle, and the evolution of support material on my website at languagetesting.info. Now, this is very much the how-to pedagogical end of language assessment literacy. Yet we've done this work independently. How do you see the relationship between your apprenticeship model and the one that I've developed?
I would say this is a wonderful surprise that we landed on this apprenticeship model through different routes. I also think this is strong evidence for the validity of such a model for assessment literacy development. One thing I would say that differentiates your work from ours is that your apprenticeship model is derived from a combination of philosophical thinking and experience of providing assessment knowledge. Like you said, this is the pedagogical end of assessment literacy. If we follow the same analogy, we came to this model more from the learning end of LAL. I remember the first time when I discussed assessment literacy with Jason, we both noticed that a lot of the literature on assessment literacy focuses on language teachers. Although it's not explicitly stated, the literature seems to suggest a clear contrast between language testers on one end, who lack and thereby need to develop assessment literacy, and language testers on the other end, who are competent in all aspects of assessment literacy. And yet the literature doesn't seem to have discussions about how language testers develop their own assessment literacy. Although we recognize the importance of assessment training for teachers, we also feel somewhat uneasy with the assumption that language testers are all well-rounded in different aspects of assessment literacy. Both of us feel comfortable with the identity of being a language tester, and yet neither of us feel truly confident that we are competent in all aspects. So this was the starting point of our paper. An essential question that we ask in our study is, who can be considered language testers? How much do we have to learn in order to be considered a language tester? As we both reflect upon our own experiences, it became quite apparent that our assessment literacy profiles are quite different. And yet we both learned about language testing by being involved in different assessment practices in our own contexts, be it assessment courses we took, the mentorship we received from our professors back in grad school, the research projects we were involved in, or the supervision of local language tests in our own work contexts after graduation. So this is also in line with our findings in the study, as I mentioned earlier. That's why we argued for this apprenticeship model, and why we also think that LAL development is mediated through these contextual and experiential factors.
Thanks for that. So, can you now say something about the implications? Do you think that the apprenticeship model will catch on? And do you think it might be useful for other stakeholder groups? I'd only thought that it was extensible to testers and teachers myself. I don't think Bart Dagers would think it appropriate for policymakers, for example.
The most important implication of our study is that assessment literacy development is mediated through contextual and experiential factors. While this is nothing groundbreaking, but as assessment trainers, the crucial step, and oftentimes a challenge, is to identify these influential and contextual experiential factors. I do think this apprenticeship model is useful for all stakeholder groups as well. Now that I've taught language testing courses at the University of Illinois for 6 years, I have observed more supporting evidence for this model. For example, in my testing classes, I have students from a wide range of backgrounds: linguistics, educational psychology, curriculum instruction, computer science, and many more. Many of these students are not planning to be teachers or testers. And I had undergrads all the way to doctoral students. One of the most important concepts that we learn in this class is validity. When I asked the students to provide a definition for validity, most of the students will be able to provide a general definition and list several forms of validity, or refer to one of the validation frameworks to help define the concept. However, if I ask them to write an essay to explain what validity is, students will start to add different real-life examples as supporting details. That's when I start to see variation in what they write in terms of, for example, what validity evidence entails for a language test, how one can gather evidence for different types of validity, and why certain types of validity are more important than others in their local contexts. And a great deal of such variability can be associated with the assessment context and their assessment experience. And knowing this helps me understand how they develop assessment literacy in this class. Now, policymakers are an interesting but complex group to study when it comes to assessment literacy, although I still think the apprenticeship model would still work on them. I have some experiences working with the admissions officers who set cut scores for TOEFL and IELTS, at both Purdue University and the University of Illinois. My experience working with them suggests that it's not necessarily the case that they are not aware of how to interpret test scores or how large-scale proficiency tests work. In fact, they might be very well aware of these issues through the practice of making admissions decisions partially based on proficiency scores and validating their decisions by examining relationships between their metrics and student academic success. This is the main form of their assessment practice, if you can say that. And they need to learn how to do this efficiently and effectively. With more and more experience, they can become quite sensitive to different metrics. However, for them, there is a much more complex formula that is guiding their decision. Their job is to select a sizable group of students who not only succeed in academic study, but also bring sufficient revenue to the university. It is a hard balance for them, given the changing socioeconomic and sociopolitical climate for study abroad. But this is often a factor that is overlooked in the scholarship of language assessment. While language testers might want to remind them about the importance of proficiency in the complex formula of admissions decisions, we also need to understand that the admissions officers' work and their decisions are also influenced by contextual factors, such as financial situation and the ranking of the university, and also competitions from peer institutions. So I think that the apprenticeship model still works. It's just that the manifestations of this model look very different from other stakeholder groups.
Well, thank you very much for talking to us about your research and for reflecting on the place of an apprenticeship pedagogy within LAL acquisition. This is a discussion that will continue for many years, and we look forward to seeing more of your research in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you, Glenn, for inviting us to share our research. Indeed, language assessment literacy is an important topic for our field, and we look forward to more conversations about it.
Thank you for listening to this issue of Language Testing Bites. Language Testing Bites is a production of the journal Language Testing from Sage Publications. You can subscribe to Language Testing Bites through iTunes, or you can download future issues from ltj.sagepub.com or from languagetesting.info. So until next time, we hope you have enjoyed the current issue of Language Testing Bites.